In 1914, something strange appears inside the requisition ledgers of foundries stretching from Leipzig to Kazan to Lviv. Government orders, not enemy artillery, not the chaos of advancing front lines, not the collateral destruction of siege or bombardment, pulled tens of thousands of bronze bells from towers, civic halls, guild buildings, and churches across Europe and the Russian Empire. The official justification was clean and urgent. The war needed metal for shell casings, and bronze was bronze. But look closely at the intake columns of those foundry records, and something refuses to resolve into that clean explanation. Alongside weight, alongside bronze content, alongside the parish name and the administrative district, there is another column: pitch, resonance radius, civic function. Details that mean nothing to an artillery factory. Details that mean everything to someone who understood what those bells had once been used for, and who wanted that understanding preserved even as the bells themselves were fed into furnaces. And here is the detail that should give you pause. In several districts across Germany and the Russian Empire, the inventory lists were drawn up before mobilization orders reached those same communities. The paper was already prepared, the columns already ruled in careful bureaucratic ink, the bells already named, measured, and classified in ways that serve no military purpose anyone has since been able to explain. Something else was being cataloged alongside the bronze. Something the war provided a convenient and final moment to document, to quantify, and then to permanently remove. To understand what that something was, to understand why those extra columns represent one of the most quietly devastating erasures in the history of urban civilization, you have to leave 1914 entirely and travel backward through Extrienride, 6 centuries, to the cities that first hung these bells in stone towers and taught their populations, generation by generation, to listen. Because what was melted in those foundries was not just bronze. It was a language. A distributed, embodied, city-scale civic grammar that had organized daily life across half the known world for more than 600 years. And the decision to melt it was not made in a war room in Berlin or a ministry corridor in St. Petersburg. It was made across 500 years of institutional patience, one decree at a time, by authorities who understood exactly what they were removing and who left just enough trace in the archive to prove it, if you know where to look and what columns to read. The story begins somewhere between the 9th and 13th centuries, in the dense, noisy, astonishingly organized cities of medieval Europe and the Eurasian trade corridor Bruges, Novgorod, Lubeck, Tabriz, Samarkand. These were not primitive settlements waiting for modernity to arrive and impose order. They were functioning civic machines of considerable sophistication, and at the operational center of each one was a system that historians have persistently and catastrophically underestimated: the bell. Not the bell as religious ornament or pious sentiment or architectural flourish, the bell as infrastructure. As the nervous system of the city itself, pre-Reformation bell systems across this corridor encoded time, market hours, curfew, fire emergency zones, guild shift changes, civic assembly calls, judicial proceedings, and territorial boundary signals, all in layered peal sequences, all transmitted through bronze vibrating in open air, all receivable by anyone within acoustic radius who had learned to listen. Each city carried a unique acoustic signature, as distinctive and as functional as any written charter. Guild contracts from the Low Countries documents that survive in Flemish municipal archives in fragmentary but legible form specify particular bell peal sequences for particular civic acts with a precision that leaves no room for ambiguity. The opening of the grain market required a specific pattern. The closing of the city gates another. The call for firefighting brigades another. Still, the signal for judicial assembly yet another. This was not religious ceremony dressed in civic language. This was administration itself, running in sound, legible to every person who had grown up inside its daily operation regardless of whether they could read a single written word. And here is the first twist. The twist that changes everything you think you know about why the bells disappeared and what their disappearance actually cost. They were not eliminated because they were dangerous in any violent or revolutionary sense. They were eliminated precisely because they were too functional, too independent, and too legible to survive inside the new centralized order that would remake Europe between the 16th and 20th centuries. The bells were erased not because they failed at their purpose. They were erased because they succeeded at it completely, and because what they communicated could not be controlled by any authority that did not also physically control the belfry and the trained hands of the person playing it. The German mystic Heinrich Seuss, writing between 1295 and 1366, described the cognitive experience of bell peal sequences in terms that sound less like theology and more like semiotics. The mind orienting itself through sound, the body navigating urban space. By following information carried in bronze vibration, the city made legible not through written signs, but through acoustic ones that arrived whether you were looking or not. He was not alone in documenting this. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan scholar who traversed the known world between 1304 and 1368, recorded experiences of city sound systems, in terms suggesting bell tower sequences functioned as navigational and civic anchors across cultures, sharing no common written language whatsoever. A merchant arriving in a foreign Hanseatic or Silk Road city could orient by the bell sequences locating the market quarter, identifying the civic assembly signal, tracking the approach of the gate closing hour without speaking the local tongue or reading a single local sign. The system constituted a pre-literate, non-textual shared civic grammar that crossed political borders and survived language barriers in a way that no written system of the era could match. More striking still is the architectural evidence. Bell towers in Bruges, in Lübeck, in Novgorod were not positioned at road intersections or at geometric centers of public squares, as later rationalist planning logic would dictate. They were positioned at points of maximum acoustic overlap placed so that their resonance radii met without dead zones, blanketing the inhabited city in an unbroken field of legible sound. This was not intuitive. This required calculation. The pattern suggests deliberate acoustic urban design of a sophistication that modern urban acoustics has only recently begun to theorize from first principles, discovering as novelty what medieval city builders appear to have known as craft. And the anomaly deepens further. The same spacing principle appears in cities that had no documented formal relationship with each other, separated by geography and politics and centuries of disconnected development. Something a body of architectural knowledge, a shared technical tradition encoded in the training of craftsmen rather than in any published text, moved between them across distances and borders that no single institution formally bridged. Who held that knowledge? Who transmitted it? And through what channels it traveled from Bruges to Novgorod to Tabriz are questions that no academic body has yet answered. Then came print. Johannes Gutenberg's press, perfected around 1450, began the long standardization of written language across Europe, and something unexpected happened alongside it. The bell language did not retreat in the face of this new technology. It expanded. In Bruges and Ghent, carillon systems grew during the 15th and 16th centuries into instruments of 40-50 individual bells, encoding increasingly complex civic sequences with a precision that required years of embodied physical training to master and decades of oral transmission to preserve across generations. Guild bellmasters, the carillonneurs, developed the system in parallel with the printed word, not in opposition to it, because the two systems occupied different cognitive registers entirely. Text for the literate few, law for the archive and the court. Bells for the daily life of every person within earshot, regardless of literacy or social standing. City Council minutes from Bruges specify bell codes for civic emergencies in granular detail sequences differing by stroke count, by interval pattern, by the temporal relationship between large and small bells rung in specific combination, revealing a mature grammar with the internal logical consistency of a developed language. And yet no one wrote the full grammar down as a complete and teachable system. No comprehensive codex was published. No authority commissioned a dictionary of peals. The knowledge lived entirely in bodies, in trained hands on rope and keyboard, in the ears of communities that had grown up inside its daily presence. That absence is not an accident of history. It is the system's first and deepest vulnerability. A grammar that lives only in embodied practice can be ended by ending the practice. And ending the practice requires no fire, no dramatic decree, no violent suppression. It requires only the quiet and patient withdrawal of institutional recognition over enough time that the loss appears to be natural forgetting rather than deliberate erasure. The Council of Trent convened in 1545 and deliberated until 1563, producing in its final sessions a body of decrees on sacred music, church property, and religious observance that would systematically reshape Catholic institutional life across the entire European continent. Among the effects not always stated explicitly in the conciliar texts themselves, but traceable through the diocesan bell use ordinances issued by reformers like Cardinal Carlo Borromeo across the 1,570 seconds and 1,590 seconds, was a progressive institutional reclassification of bell function that amounted to a privative.com, quiet administrative amputation. Pre-Trent Guild contracts had listed more than 12 distinct civic peal functions for a single city's bells, functions covering the full range of daily urban life. Post-Trent diocesan ordinances, where they addressed bells at all, recognized precisely three: the call to Mass, the announcement of death, and the marking of canonical hours. Guild peals, market signals, civic assembly calls, fire codes, territorial markers. These were not banned outright in most jurisdictions. They were demoted, reclassified from official civic function to folk custom, stripped of their contractual and legal standing, left to survive only in the diminishing habit of communities that still remembered them, but now had no institutional framework to sustain or defend that memory. The reduction was institutional in origin and administrative in mechanism, not organic in development. Communities did not independently decide to simplify their bell language because it had grown cumbersome or irrelevant. An administrative framework made that decision for them and then waited, with the patience that only institutions possess, for time to do the rest. The pattern suggests deliberate strategic calculation, a system enabling citizens to self-organize, self-signal, and self-assemble without any reference to church authority or crown administration was precisely the kind of system that post-Trent centralization could not afford to legitimize with official standing. They did not silence the bells. They simply redefined what the bells were permitted to mean and waited for the meanings they had stripped away to fade through the slow, undramatic erosion that follows the withdrawal of institutional support. The most clarifying single event in this long suppression happened not in Rome but in Novgorod in 1478. Ivan III of Moscow had spent years systematically dismantling the Novgorod Republic, one of medieval Europe's most enduring experiments in civic self-governance. A city-state that had maintained participatory democratic institutions for over 3 centuries, and when the final annexation came, he did something that Muscovite chronicles recorded with the matter-of-fact precision of a logistics report. He removed the Veche bell. The Veche was Novgorod's citizen assembly, the body that voted on questions of war and peace, on law, on the selection and dismissal of city officials. It was summoned by a specific bell whose peal sequences were known to every adult inhabitant and whose sound carried one unambiguous civic meaning: the people are being called to decide. Ivan took that bell and transported it physically to Moscow. The act is documented in the Chronicle record. Its symbolic resonance is acknowledged by historians who cover this period. What is almost never foregrounded is its systemic acoustic consequence. Within a single generation, according to Novgorod Chronicle fragments that survive the period, the city's full civic bell language had collapsed into unintelligibility. Citizens could no longer parse the remaining peal sequences. The grammar had been held together by a single keystone signal, the assembly bell, whose meaning anchored every other sequence in the hierarchy, and with the keystone removed, the entire structure fell into silence within living memory, without a single additional bell being touched. Ivan III may not have understood the acoustic mechanics in technical terms, but the surgical precision of what he chose to remove. Not the belfry, not the tower walls, not the bronze in bulk and by weight, but the one specific bell that anchored the civic grammar suggests a comprehension colder and more deliberate than symbolic theater. He took one bell, and a century of civic language went silent with it. The second great twist in this story arrives with Napoleon between 1800 and 1815, as French imperial administration reorganized the occupied Low Countries and Rhine territories into rationalized prefectural departments. A series of ordinances emerged from prefectural offices that addressed bell usage in terms far more technically specific than any general noise ordinance or religious regulation would require. Guild peals and market signals were prohibited, designated explicitly as sources of seditious assembly signals, and the decree language did not stop at general prohibition. It identified particular peal sequences by civic function and targeted them by description. Here is where the story turns. To ban a specific peal sequence, you must know what it signals. To know what it signals, you must possess or have access to the grammar that encodes it. French imperial administrators in occupied Flemish cities had either cultivated local informants who provided detailed acoustic intelligence, commissioned their own systematic surveys of surviving peal traditions, or located somewhere a document that no official French archive has since produced in publicly accessible form, a codebook, a systematic record of the civic grammar, compiled at some point by someone with both the knowledge and the institutional motivation to write it down. The suppressor's logic was not ignorance stumbling over local custom. The Napoleonic prefectural ordinances demonstrate that the erasers understood the system with sufficient precision to dismantle it surgically, sequence by sequence, function by function, leaving in place only those peals whose meanings served, rather than threatened, centralized administration. You do not ban what you do not understand. And they understood exactly what they were banning. Which means the knowledge of the grammar existed somewhere in institutional form, documented and accessible, long enough to be used as a targeting instrument against the very system it described. The final blow before 1914 was technological, and it arrived with an administrative gentleness that rendered it nearly invisible as an act of erasure. Between 1880 and 1910, electric clock systems were installed across the city centers of Prussia, Russia, and Austria-Hungary as components of municipal modernization campaigns driven by the nation-state's need for uniform, standardized, centrally controlled timekeeping. The installation contracts, preserved in city archives in Berlin, Vienna, and St. Petersburg, contain a phrase that appears with a consistency too regular to be coincidental. Bell tower civic functions are described as superseded, not supplemented, not translated into new form or documented for future reference. Superseded, a word that closes a chapter without summarizing it. The electric clock would perform what the bell had performed. But the transition was administrative rather than cultural, and the old sequences were not documented in any surviving transition record. No municipal authority produced a comprehensive account of the peal grammar it was rendering obsolete. No commission sat with the aging carillonneurs and asked them to enumerate what was being lost and how it had functioned. By 1910, in cities where electric systems had been fully installed, municipal records contained zero surviving documentation of the peal grammar that had organized daily life a generation earlier. The changeover erased institutional memory inside a single administrative generation, quietly and without ceremony, classified as routine modernization rather than cultural loss. The bells still hung in their towers. The towers still stood in the civic squares. But the knowledge of how to read the bronze had already been administratively discarded. And by the time the foundry orders came in 1914, the population that might have protested the loss of something irreplaceable had already, without knowing it, lost the ability to name what was being taken. In August 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm II's war government issued emergency metal requisition orders that would expand and formalize into the Glockenabgabe, the official bell surrender program, by 1917. Parishes across Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the occupied territories were required to surrender their bells by weight category, destined for the foundry and the shell casing and the front. The justification was industrial and total. But inside the foundry intake records found in fragments across several German industrial archives, the same anomaly appears with the persistence of a detail that refuses to be coincidental. Alongside weight measurements required for artillery calculations, alongside parish registration data required for administrative tracking, the bells were cataloged for pitch. The data was recorded carefully, in separate columns, and filed apart from the main requisition records in a form whose destination no official justification addresses. Someone in the middle of a world war, with furnaces burning continuously and shell quotas mounting week by week, was still taking methodical notes on how the bells sang. What those notes were for, where they went, and whether they were ever compiled into a larger survey of the acoustic heritage, being permanently destroyed. These are questions that no archive has answered. The pitch records exist in fragments. Their purpose remains officially unaccounted for. And that unexplained column in a wartime intake ledger is the thread that, pulled with patience, begins to unravel the entire official story of what was actually being removed when the requisition orders went out. The Soviet campaigns that followed between 1929 and 1933 completed with industrial efficiency what the war had begun. Leon Trotsky had laid the ideological groundwork for treating church property, including bells, as material resources to be reclaimed for the state. The League of Militant Atheists oversaw removal campaigns across Soviet territory that stripped an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 bells from towers in a 4-year period. The removals were total, rapid, and coordinated across geographic distances that would have made spontaneous local uniformity impossible. They contained a procedural instruction appearing in multiple regional orders, issued by different local authorities across different parts of the country, instruction that could only have been generated consistently if it came from centralized guidance. The bells were not to be rung during removal. Workers were explicitly directed to take them down in silence. No final peal. The instruction makes no operational sense for a smelting program. Bronze bound for a furnace produces no intelligence if it rings once in transit. The silence order makes sense only if authorities understood that a bell's final peal could reach a community still carrying the grammar in living memory. That one last ring in the right sequence might remind people not only of what they were losing, but of how to read it. The order wasn't just to remove the bells. It was to remove them without a sound from 40,000 towers across a continent in coordinated institutional silence. And yet, something survived. In Mechelen, Belgium, a carillonneur named Jeff Denine, working between 1900 and 1920 at the Royal Carillon School, created a written notation system for peal sequences. He created it for performance, not preservation to teach students to play, not to rescue a suppressed grammar from oblivion. But when researchers compare the sequences in Denine's notation to guild contracts from the 15th and 16th centuries, 400 years earlier, the peal sequences match. The civic grammar demoted by Trent, targeted by Napoleon, discarded by municipal modernization, had continued living inside the hands and ears of performers who passed it between generations without recognizing it as a historical survival. It was preserved the way all living knowledge survives: institutional erasure, practiced without comment, transmitted without documentation, hidden inside something that looked like music and therefore attracted no suppression order, no requisition form, no administrative reclassification. In Rostov-on-Don, wax cylinder recordings made before 1914 and held in phonographic archives not yet fully cataloged represent the only known acoustic documentation of a complete Eastern bell peal grammar system. The recordings exist. The grammar is audible within them. No institution has yet produced a comprehensive analysis of what civic information those sequences contained, or what they reveal about the relationship between Eastern and Western bell grammar traditions. The code survived. Hidden inside music that everyone had forgotten was a language, and it is still waiting in the archive for someone whose job it is to read it. After 1945, when Europe built its new frameworks for deciding what would be protected and what permitted to remain lost, cultural heritage was defined in terms of the physical and the visible: monuments, buildings, objects that could be photographed and fenced, and assigned a preservation budget. The UNESCO founding documents of 1,945 established categories that protected stone while leaving acoustic, performative, and procedural civic knowledge entirely outside the framework. That gap persisted for 58 years through Reconstruction, through the Cold War, through the digital transformation of urban life, until the 2003 UNESCO Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage finally recognized that a civic practice, a transmitted oral grammar, a community of performers carrying knowledge in their bodies could constitute heritage worth protecting. 58 years. Long enough for the last generation of Carolinours who had learned the full pre-requisition grammar to age out of practice without successors. Long enough for wax cylinders to degrade at their edges. Long enough for the communities that once lived inside the acoustic grammar of their cities to forget entirely that forgetting had ever occurred. The absence of acoustic heritage from the 1945 framework was not bureaucratic oversight. The post-war rebuilding of Europe required standardized civic infrastructure, unified timekeeping, centralized emergency broadcast, nationally coordinated signal systems that reached citizens as passive recipients rather than active readers. A framework recognizing distributed civic acoustic grammar as legitimate heritage would have complicated that project in ways that no post-war administration was prepared to accommodate. The silence was not the absence of bells. It was the absence of anyone whose institutional responsibility it was to notice what had gone and to name the going as loss rather than progress. Stand today in any major European or Russian city center and listen. Your phone carries an alarm tuned to frequencies calibrated to produce alert without panic. The pedestrian crossing signals with a tone. Emergency notifications arrive as audio pulses designed by acoustic engineers working from standards documents running to hundreds of pages. Civil defense broadcast networks in dozens of countries can reach every citizen simultaneously with a sound signal whose meaning has been predetermined and centrally assigned. The functions are structurally, operationally, and socially identical to what the bell peal grammar performed across 6 centuries of urban life. Time, emergency, assembly, market signal, curfew, territorial boundary, civic event. The instrument changed entirely. The function never moved an inch. And in every smart city acoustic design standard of the last 30 years, every ISO framework, every municipal notification protocol, every networked urban audio specification, there is no reference to the bell grammar tradition as precedent, ancestor, or even historical curiosity worth a footnote. The reinvention presents itself as pure invention. The continuity is unacknowledged by the institutions that recreated it. The engineers who rebuilt the system in digital and networked form did not know and were not told that they were rebuilding something that had been deliberately and systematically taken apart. What remains is Jeff Denine's notation in a school archive in Mechelen, a set of wax cylinder recordings in a Russian collection awaiting full analysis, and those anomalous pitch columns in wartime foundry ledgers from a conflict that ended more than a century ago. Columns filled in carefully, deliberately, in the middle of an industrial slaughter, for reasons no official record has explained. The cities kept singing. They changed the voice and removed every trace of the words. The question that remains, the one no government commission, no heritage body, no municipal archive has formally answered, is not why the bells were melted. Metal was needed and metal was taken, and that story is clean and documented and closed. The question is, who decided, across 5 centuries of patient institutional coordination, that citizens should go on receiving the signal in perpetuity, but should never again be taught to read it? That question has been filed somewhere. There is almost certainly a column for it. The column, like so much else in this record, has been left deliberately, carefully, and completely blank. And the blank, when you finally learn to see it, is the most legible thing in the entire archive.